Maria Gonzalez wiped the sweat from her forehead as she looked at the pile of eviction notices scattered across her kitchen table. The single mother of 3 had been working double shifts at the downtown diner for months, but it still wasn't enough to keep up with the rising rent in her neighborhood. Gentrification was sweeping through East Valley like a tidal wave, pushing out families who had lived there for generations. The apartment complex where Maria had raised her children for 8 years was being sold to developers who planned to tear it down and build luxury condos. Along with 47 other families, she had received a notice giving them 60 days to find new housing. The problem was that affordable apartments in the area had become as rare as snow in summer. At 34, Maria had never considered herself an activist. She kept her head down, worked hard, and tried to provide for her kids the best way she knew how. Her eldest daughter, Carmen, was a junior in high school with dreams of becoming a nurse. Her twin boys, Diego and Miguel, were in middle school and finally settled into good routines after years of struggling with their father's abandonment. The community meeting held in the basement of St. Anthony's Church was packed with worried faces. Families who had been neighbors for years sat together, sharing stories of frantic apartment searches and impossible rental prices. The lucky few who had found new places would be moving their children to different schools, breaking apart social networks that had taken years to build. Developer Richard Hawthorne arrived at the meeting with his lawyer and a public relations consultant. He was a tall man in an expensive suit who spoke in corporate language about urban renewal and maximizing property values. His presentation was polished and professional, complete with glossy brochures showing sleek new buildings that would transform the neighborhood. "I understand this transition is difficult," Hawthorne said, his voice carrying the practiced sympathy of someone who had given similar speeches many times before. "But progress requires change. These new developments will bring jobs and economic growth that will benefit everyone in the long run." Maria sat in the back row, listening as her neighbors asked desperate questions about relocation assistance and timeline extensions. Hawthorne's answers were polite but firm. The development schedule was non-negotiable and the company had no obligation to provide moving expenses or help families find alternative housing. When Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly woman who had lived in the building for 23 years, broke down crying while describing her inability to find affordable housing on her fixed income, Hawthorne barely acknowledged her distress. He simply repeated that the sale was a private business transaction, and the tenant's personal circumstances were not his responsibility. That night, Maria couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Carmen's face when she learned they might have to move to a different school district, potentially derailing her college preparation programs. The twins had finally found their place in the community after years of adjustment difficulties, and uprooting them again seemed cruel and unnecessary. Maria had always been the type of person who solved problems quietly and methodically. Instead of complaining about unfair situations, she researched solutions. Instead of accepting defeat, she looked for alternative approaches that others might have overlooked. Her coworkers at the diner often joked that she could find a way to make anything work if she put her mind to it. The next morning, Maria visited the public library and spent hours researching tenant rights and housing laws. She discovered that the city had recently passed ordinances requiring developers to provide relocation assistance in certain circumstances, but the rules were complex, and many tenants were unaware of their rights. She also learned about successful community organizing campaigns in other cities where residents had fought similar displacement efforts. Some had managed to negotiate better terms with developers, while others had convinced city councils to intervene on behalf of vulnerable residents. The key seemed to be presenting unified, well-documented cases that were difficult for officials to ignore. Maria began making lists of every family in the complex, documenting their situations and the hardships they would face if forced to relocate quickly. She collected information about school enrollments, medical needs, work locations, and family circumstances that made moving particularly difficult. Her research revealed that Hawthorne's development company had received significant tax incentives from the city based on promises to include affordable housing units in their projects. However, none of his recent developments had actually delivered on those commitments. The pattern suggested a systematic strategy of using public incentives to maximize private profits while ignoring community needs. Maria realized that fighting this eviction would require more than individual complaints or emotional appeals. It would demand a coordinated campaign that combined legal knowledge, political pressure, media attention, and community solidarity. The challenge seemed overwhelming for someone who had never organized anything more complicated than a birthday party. But as she looked at the photographs of her children on her refrigerator, Maria felt something shift inside her. The quiet determination that had helped her survive as a single mother began focusing on this new challenge. If Hawthorne and his associates thought the families in East Valley would simply disappear without a fight, they were about to discover how wrong they could be. Maria decided to start small, reaching out to her immediate neighbors to see who might be willing to work together on researching their options. She had no idea that this first step would eventually lead to a confrontation that would change not just her own life, but the entire trajectory of development politics in her city. Within 2 weeks, Maria had organized informal meetings with 12 families from her apartment complex. They gathered in her small living room every Tuesday evening after dinner, sharing information and coordinating their response to the pending evictions. What started as desperate conversations about finding new apartments gradually evolved into strategic discussions about challenging the development project itself. Mrs. Chen, who had immigrated from Taiwan 15 years earlier, brought detailed financial records showing how the rent increases over the past 2 years had already forced 3 families from the building. Mr. Johnson, a veteran who worked nights at the hospital, provided insight into city council procedures from his experience advocating for veterans' housing issues. The group's first breakthrough came when Maria's neighbor, David Kim, discovered that Hawthorne Development had failed to file required environmental impact studies for the new construction. As a graduate student in urban planning, David understood the bureaucratic processes that developers were supposed to follow, and he began finding discrepancies in their permit applications. Maria coordinated the research efforts while continuing to work her regular shifts at the diner. She created spreadsheets tracking every document, deadline, and legal requirement related to their situation. Her systematic approach impressed the other residents, who had expected their organizing efforts to be more chaotic and emotional. The breakthrough moment came during their 4th meeting, when Mrs. Rodriguez mentioned that her grandson worked for a local television news station. The elderly woman had been reluctant to involve media attention, fearing retaliation from their landlord, but Maria convinced her that publicity might be their most effective tool for pressuring city officials to intervene. Reporter Jessica Martinez arrived at their next meeting with a camera crew, initially planning to film a standard human interest story about families facing eviction. However, when Maria presented her detailed research about Hawthorne's pattern of broken promises and regulatory violations, the story transformed into an investigation of potential corruption in the city's development approval process. The news report aired during the evening broadcast 3 days later, featuring interviews with affected families and city officials who were clearly uncomfortable answering questions about why Hawthorne had been awarded contracts, despite failing to meet affordable housing commitments in previous projects. Hawthorne's response was swift and aggressive. Within 24 hours of the broadcast, residents received notices threatening legal action against anyone who made false and defamatory statements about the development company. The letters were clearly designed to intimidate people into silence, but they had the opposite effect on Maria and her core group of organizers. "They wouldn't be threatening us if we weren't onto something important," Maria told the group during their emergency meeting to discuss the legal threats. "Companies that have nothing to hide don't try this hard to silence their critics." David Kim had been researching similar cases in other cities and discovered that intimidation tactics were a standard response from developers facing organized community resistance. He found examples of successful campaigns where residents had overcome legal threats by documenting everything carefully and maintaining public attention on their cause. Maria decided to escalate their efforts by requesting meetings with city council members and the mayor's office. She prepared detailed presentations showing how the rapid displacement of low-income families was creating a housing crisis that would eventually affect the entire city's economy and social stability. The first city council member they met with, Councilwoman Patricia Stone, was sympathetic, but warned them that challenging major developments required significant political capital and legal expertise that community groups rarely possessed. She suggested they contact legal aid organizations that might provide assistance with housing rights cases. Maria's research skills proved invaluable once again. She discovered that the city had recently received a federal grant specifically designated for preventing displacement of low-income residents in areas undergoing development pressure. The grant money was supposed to fund relocation assistance and affordable housing preservation programs, but the funds had been sitting unused in city accounts for over a year. Armed with this information, Maria and her group requested a formal meeting with Mayor James Crawford. They prepared a comprehensive proposal outlining how the federal grant money could be used to either help families relocate with adequate assistance or to negotiate with Hawthorne for including genuine affordable units in his development project. The mayor's initial response was dismissive. His assistant explained that the city couldn't interfere with private property transactions and that development projects were essential for maintaining the tax base that funded city services. Maria was told that while the administration sympathized with their situation, economic progress sometimes required difficult transitions. However, Maria had learned that persistence and documentation could overcome initial rejections. She began attending every city council meeting, bringing different families to speak during public comment periods about the human impact of displacement policies. Each presentation included specific examples of how the lack of affordable housing was affecting children's education, healthcare access, and family stability. The sustained pressure began creating political problems for elected officials who had previously ignored housing displacement issues. Local newspapers started covering the story regularly, and community groups from other neighborhoods facing similar pressures began reaching out to learn from Maria's organizing strategies. Hawthorne Development responded by hiring a public relations firm and launching a campaign emphasizing the economic benefits of their project. They distributed glossy materials highlighting job creation and tax revenue increases, while characterizing the community opposition as resistance to progress and economic growth. Maria realized that their grassroots organizing effort was evolving into a broader political battle about the future of development in their city. The stakes were becoming much higher than simply saving one apartment complex, and the opposition they faced was more sophisticated and well-funded than she had initially understood. The intimidation campaign against Maria and her neighbors intensified dramatically after their third television appearance. Anonymous flyers appeared throughout the apartment complex, warning residents that troublemakers would face consequences beyond just eviction. Several families received suspicious phone calls at odd hours, and someone spray-painted "Move Out" across Maria's car windshield. Rather than backing down, Maria documented every incident and reported them to police, creating an official record of harassment that would later prove crucial. She also organized a neighborhood watch system, ensuring that no family felt isolated or vulnerable to further intimidation attempts. The pressure was taking a personal toll that Maria tried to hide from her children and neighbors. She was losing weight from stress and working overtime at the diner to pay for photocopying, gas money for attending meetings, and other organizing expenses. Carmen had begun staying after school to help with research, teaching herself about housing law and city politics in ways that impressed even the adults involved in their campaign. Hawthorne Development made their first significant mistake during a heated city council meeting where they attempted to fast-track the approval process. Their lawyer argued that delays were costing the company money, and that community opposition was based on misinformation spread by professional agitators who didn't understand economic development. Maria had anticipated this attack on their credibility and came prepared with documentation showing that every fact they had presented was supported by public records and city documents. When the lawyer claimed that affordable housing requirements were unreasonable and economically unfeasible, Maria presented financial analysis showing that similar projects in other cities had successfully included affordable units while remaining profitable. The turning point came when David Kim discovered that Hawthorne had been using different financial projections for their tax incentive applications than they had submitted for their construction loans. The discrepancies suggested they were either misleading the city about their costs or lying to their lenders about their expected profits. This evidence transformed their campaign from a neighborhood housing dispute into a potential fraud investigation. Maria immediately contacted the reporter who had been covering their story, and within days, the financial irregularities were front-page news in both daily newspapers. City Attorney Rebecca Walsh announced that her office would conduct a formal review of all documents related to the Hawthorne development project. The announcement created breathing room for the families facing eviction, as the City Council voted to suspend all approvals pending the legal review. Hawthorne's response was to hire one of the city's most prominent law firms and launch a counterattack against Maria personally. Private investigators began questioning her coworkers at the diner, asking about her immigration status, her ex-husband's criminal record, and her family's financial situation. The message was clear. They were trying to find anything that could be used to discredit her leadership of the community campaign. Maria had expected personal attacks and had prepared for them by being completely transparent about her background from the beginning. When the investigators' questions reached her boss at the diner, she proactively discussed the situation with him, explaining that her community organizing work was being targeted by powerful interests who wanted to silence opposition voices. The investigation tactics backfired when several of Maria's co-workers became outraged that someone was trying to dig up dirt on a woman they respected for her work ethic and integrity. The diner's manager, Frank Ricci, had watched Maria handle difficult customers and stressful situations for 3 years, and he publicly supported her right to advocate for her family and community. Meanwhile, the city's legal review was uncovering serious problems with Hawthorne's project approvals. The environmental impact studies had been rushed and incomplete. The affordable housing commitments were vaguely worded and difficult to enforce, and the financial projections appeared to have been deliberately inflated to justify larger tax incentive packages. Maria used this momentum to expand their coalition beyond the immediate neighborhood. She reached out to environmental groups concerned about the development's impact on local watersheds, historic preservation advocates worried about the loss of architecturally significant buildings, and fiscal conservatives who opposed corporate welfare disguised as economic development incentives. The broader coalition allowed them to present a more comprehensive case against the project that went beyond displacement concerns to include environmental protection, historical preservation, and responsible use of public funds. Each group brought expertise and credibility that strengthened their overall argument. Hawthorne Development found themselves fighting battles on multiple fronts, with their legal problems compounding as investigators discovered additional irregularities in their permit applications and financial documentation. The company had clearly expected to overwhelm community opposition through intimidation and political pressure, but they had underestimated both Maria's strategic capabilities and the depth of public concern about unchecked development. The campaign was consuming Maria's life in ways that worried her children and closest friends. She was attending meetings almost every night, spending weekends researching legal documents, and using every spare moment to coordinate with coalition partners and media contacts. Carmen had stepped up to help with household responsibilities, but Maria knew the situation was placing unfair burdens on her teenage daughter. However, Maria also recognized that they were approaching a decisive moment in their campaign. The legal review was nearing completion. The media attention had created political pressure for action, and public opinion was clearly shifting in their favor. After months of defensive organizing, they were finally in a position to go on the offensive and demand real solutions to the housing crisis their neighborhood was facing. The question was whether Hawthorne Development would accept a negotiated settlement that addressed community concerns, or whether they would escalate the conflict further by using their political connections and financial resources to overcome the legal and public relations problems they were facing. The city's legal review concluded with a damning 40-page report that found multiple violations of municipal codes and state regulations in Hawthorne Development's project approvals. City Attorney Rebecca Walsh announced at a packed press conference that the development permits were being revoked pending a complete reevaluation of the entire approval process. Maria watched the press conference from the break room at the diner, surrounded by co-workers who cheered when Walsh described the systematic irregularities that had been discovered during the investigation. After 6 months of organizing, researching, and fighting, their community campaign had achieved something that seemed impossible when they started: stopping a major development project backed by powerful interests. However, Maria knew that revoking the permits was just the beginning of a longer battle. Hawthorne Development had too much money invested in the project to simply walk away, and they possessed political connections that could potentially overcome legal obstacles if the community pressure diminished. Within 24 hours of the permit revocation, Hawthorne's legal team filed appeals in both state and federal court, arguing that the city's review process had been biased and politically motivated. They claimed that community opposition had contaminated what should have been an objective evaluation of their compliance with regulations. The appeals process would take months to resolve, creating uncertainty for the 47 families who still didn't know whether they would be forced to move. Maria realized they needed to use this time to develop long-term solutions rather than simply celebrating their temporary victory. She organized community meetings to discuss what kind of development the neighborhood actually wanted to see. Instead of just opposing Hawthorne's project, they began creating their own vision for how the area could grow while preserving affordable housing and community character. The planning sessions revealed sophisticated thinking among residents who had been dismissed by developers and politicians as obstacles to progress. Mrs. Chen presented detailed proposals for mixed-income housing that would preserve affordability while improving building conditions. Mr. Johnson outlined transportation improvements that could support development without displacing existing residents. Maria coordinated these discussions into a comprehensive community development plan that addressed housing, transportation, environmental concerns, and economic opportunities. The document demonstrated that neighborhood opposition wasn't simply resistance to change, but rather advocacy for development that served existing residents instead of displacing them. The community plan attracted attention from urban planning professors, affordable housing advocates, and progressive politicians who were looking for alternatives to the gentrification patterns that were transforming cities across the country. Maria found herself invited to speak at conferences and academic forums about community-controlled development strategies. Meanwhile, Hawthorne Development was facing financial pressures that their public relations campaign couldn't address. The legal delays were costing money, their investors were growing nervous about the negative publicity, and other city councils were beginning to scrutinize their projects more carefully based on the irregularities that had been discovered. The IE company made several attempts to negotiate directly with Maria and the core organizing group, offering relocation payments and other concessions in exchange for withdrawing their opposition to the project. However, Maria had learned that individual settlements often divided communities and allowed developers to proceed with minimal changes to their original plans. Instead of negotiating privately, Maria insisted that any discussions include all affected residents and focus on alternatives that would preserve the neighborhood's affordability while allowing appropriate development to proceed. This approach frustrated Hawthorne's representatives, who were accustomed to making deals with individual property owners rather than organized communities. The breakthrough came when Councilwoman Patricia Stone proposed using the federal grant, money that Maria had discovered, to purchase the apartment complex from its current owner and convert it into permanently affordable cooperative housing. The proposal would remove the buildings from the speculative real estate market while allowing residents to build equity and control their own housing costs. Maria immediately recognized the potential of this approach, but she also understood that implementing it would require navigating complex financing, legal, and organizational challenges. She began researching successful housing cooperatives in other cities, learning about everything from mortgage structures to democratic decision-making processes. The cooperative proposal gained support from an unexpected source when several local banks expressed interest in providing financing for the project. Community development loan officers explained that cooperatives often had lower default rates than conventional rental properties because residents had ownership stakes in maintaining their buildings and communities. Hawthorne Development responded to the cooperative proposal by intensifying their political lobbying efforts. They hired additional lobbyists to pressure city council members and began making campaign contributions to politicians who had previously been neutral on development issues. The company also launched a media campaign characterizing the cooperative proposal as socialist housing experiments that would decrease property values and create management problems. Their advertisements featured images of deteriorating public housing projects, suggesting that community-controlled housing inevitably led to poor maintenance and social problems. Maria countered these attacks by organizing tours of successful housing cooperatives in nearby cities, allowing council members and reporters to see examples of well-maintained, democratically managed buildings where residents had created stable, affordable communities. The political battle was becoming more sophisticated and expensive as both sides recognized that the outcome would establish precedents for future development conflicts throughout the region. Maria realized that their grassroots organizing campaign had evolved into a test case for whether communities could successfully challenge developer-driven gentrification through legal and political action. The stakes had grown far beyond saving one apartment complex. They were now fighting for a fundamentally different approach to urban development that prioritized community needs over developer profits, and the opposition was mobilizing all available resources to prevent that alternative model from succeeding. The decisive city council vote was scheduled for a Thursday evening in March, nearly 10 months after Maria had received her first eviction notice. The council chambers were packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds watching on screens set up in the lobby and parking lot. Media outlets from across the state had sent reporters to cover what had become a nationally watched test case of community organizing versus corporate development power. Maria arrived 3 hours early, accompanied by her 3 children and dozens of neighbors who had become like extended family through their shared struggle. Carmen wore her school debate team blazer, having prepared to speak during public comment about how the organizing campaign had taught her about civic engagement and democratic participation. Hawthorne Development brought their own crowd of supporters, including construction workers who had been promised jobs on the project and business leaders who argued that blocking development would discourage investment in the city. The company had spent heavily on advertising and lobbying in the weeks leading up to the vote, making final pushes to convince council members that economic growth should take priority over housing preservation. The public comment period lasted over 2 hours, with speakers alternating between supporting the cooperative housing proposal and defending the original development project. Maria was the final speaker, and she had prepared remarks that summarized everything their community had learned during 10 months of organizing and research. This vote isn't just about 47 families or one apartment building, Maria told the packed chamber, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. This is about what kind of city we want to be. Do we want development that serves the people who already live here? Or do we want development that pushes out existing residents to make room for people who can pay higher prices? She presented the community development plan that residents had created, showing how their neighborhood could grow and improve while preserving affordability and community character. The plan had been endorsed by urban planning experts, environmental groups, and affordable housing advocates who recognized it as a model that other communities could adapt to their own circumstances. When Maria finished speaking, the chamber erupted in sustained applause that continued for several minutes despite the mayor's attempts to restore order. The emotional response reflected months of community building that had transformed a collection of individual families into a unified political force. The council deliberation revealed deep divisions among elected officials who were facing intense pressure from both sides. Councilwoman Patricia Stone presented the legal and financial arguments supporting the cooperative proposal, while Councilman Robert Hayes argued that blocking private development would create dangerous precedents for property rights and economic growth. The pivotal moment came when Councilman David Park, who had been undecided throughout the debate, announced his support for the cooperative proposal. Park explained that the community's detailed planning work had convinced him that resident-controlled development could achieve economic goals while preserving neighborhood stability. The final vote was 4-3 in favor of using federal grant money to purchase the apartment complex and convert it to cooperative housing. The narrow margin reflected the political difficulty of challenging developer interests, but the victory was complete and legally binding. Maria felt overwhelming relief as neighbors hugged and cried around her. After 10 months of stress, uncertainty, and constant organizing work, they had achieved something that housing advocates had told them was nearly impossible: stopping gentrification, displacement through community organizing and political action. However, Maria knew that implementing the cooperative housing project would require sustained effort over many months. Converting rental apartments to cooperative ownership involved complex legal and financial processes that would test their organizational capabilities in new ways. Hawthorne Development immediately announced plans to appeal the council decision in court, arguing that the vote had been influenced by political pressure rather than objective evaluation of their project's merits. The legal challenges would continue for months, requiring ongoing vigilance and community solidarity to protect their victory. The national media attention brought opportunities and challenges that Maria hadn't anticipated. Housing advocates from other cities wanted to learn from their organizing strategies, while developers and their political allies sought to understand how community opposition had overcome such significant financial and political advantages. Maria realized that their local victory had implications far beyond their neighborhood. They had demonstrated that ordinary families could successfully challenge powerful development interests when they combined careful research, strategic organizing, and sustained political pressure. The model they had created was already being studied and adapted by communities facing similar displacement pressures across the country. 2 years after the city council vote, Maria stood in the community garden that residents had created in the courtyard of their cooperative housing complex. The transformation was remarkable. What had once been a neglected patch of weeds and broken concrete was now a thriving space where children played and neighbors gathered for evening conversations in multiple languages. The conversion to cooperative ownership had taken 18 months to complete, involving legal battles, financing, negotiations, and endless community meetings to establish democratic governance structures. Maria had been elected as the first president of the cooperative board, a role that required her to learn about property management, municipal regulations, and conflict resolution among neighbors with different priorities and perspectives. Carmen was now a freshman at the State University, studying social work with a specialization in community organizing. Her college application essay about growing up during the housing campaign had impressed admissions officers who rarely encountered applicants with such direct experience in civic engagement. She worked part-time for a nonprofit organization that helped other communities develop cooperative housing projects. The twins, Diego and Miguel, had become neighborhood celebrities among younger children who looked up to them as the sons of the woman who had saved the apartments. They took pride in explaining to visitors how their mother had organized the campaign that prevented their displacement and created the cooperative where they now lived. Maria's role as a community leader had expanded far beyond their immediate neighborhood. She served on the city's Affordable Housing Advisory Committee, consulted with community groups facing displacement in other areas, and had been invited to speak at national conferences about grassroots organizing strategies. The cooperative housing model they had pioneered was being replicated in 12 other cities, with communities adapting their organizing methods and governance structures to local conditions. Maria received regular calls from housing advocates who wanted advice about overcoming developer opposition and navigating municipal approval processes. Hawthorne Development had eventually abandoned their legal appeals after 18 months of unsuccessful court challenges. The company had faced financial difficulties when other cities began scrutinizing their projects more carefully, and several of their developments had been delayed or canceled due to community opposition inspired by Maria's successful campaign. Richard Hawthorne himself had been forced to step down as company president after investigators discovered additional irregularities in his business practices. The man who had dismissed community concerns as obstacles to progress was now facing federal charges for tax fraud and misuse of municipal development incentives. The broader impact of their victory extended beyond housing policy into municipal politics and development practices. The City Council had passed new ordinances requiring meaningful community input for all major development projects, and developers were now expected to demonstrate how their plans would benefit existing residents, rather than displacing them. Maria's personal transformation had been as dramatic as the changes in her neighborhood. The quiet diner worker who had never considered herself an activist was now recognized as one of the most effective community organizers in the region. She had developed expertise in areas she had never imagined learning about, from municipal, finance to media relations to coalition building across diverse communities. The organizing skills she had developed were transferable to other challenges facing working families. Maria had helped establish a credit union that provided affordable financial services to immigrants and low-income residents who had been excluded from traditional banking. She had also worked on campaigns for living wage ordinances and affordable healthcare access. However, Maria's greatest satisfaction came from the daily evidence that their community was thriving. Children who had faced the trauma of potential displacement were now growing up in stable housing with parents who owned equity in their homes. Elderly residents like Mrs. Rodriguez were aging in place with dignity instead of being forced into unfamiliar neighborhoods or inadequate housing. The cooperative had become a model of democratic decision-making that attracted visitors from around the world. Residents had established committees for maintenance, finance, social activities, and conflict resolution. Monthly meetings were conducted in both English and Spanish, with translation provided to ensure that all residents could participate fully in governing their community. Maria often reflected on the difference between the fearful woman who had first read those eviction notices and the confident leader she had become through necessity and community support. The transformation hadn't been easy or comfortable, but it had revealed capabilities she hadn't known she possessed. The diner where Maria had worked during the organizing campaign had closed when the owner retired, but he had offered to sell the business to Maria at a reduced price because of his respect for her work ethic and community leadership. She was considering the opportunity, recognizing that owning a small business could provide financial stability while allowing her to continue her organizing work. Carmen often told friends that watching her mother's transformation had shaped her own career goals and values. She had learned that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they combined careful research, strategic thinking, and unwavering commitment to their communities. As Maria surveyed the thriving community that had emerged from their struggle against displacement, she understood that their victory had been about much more than saving apartments or stopping one development project. They had proven that communities could control their own destinies when they organized effectively and refused to accept that profit-driven development was inevitable or unstoppable.